Virginia was the most decorated program to probably play during the 1980s, even though they didn't win a national championship. Chaminade was plainly the most decorated small school, certainly in the history of college basketball, and were at that time. I wanted to tell their stories. For Chaminade, it was a true dream season. They'd beaten the University of Hawaii from 2 miles away, and then they beat Virginia, which was national news. Everybody expected them to win the national championship in the NAIA format. And Ralph had come back largely for his senior year so that he could win a national championship at Virginia.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So we're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you make the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 143. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to welcome writer Jack Danilewicz to the show. We discuss his debut book, The Greatest Upset Never Seen. Virginia, Chaminade, and the Game That Changed College Basketball. Future Basketball Hall of Famer, 7'4" Ralph Sampson and his Virginia Cavaliers, number 1 ranked team in the nation, flew to Hawaii for a game that neither school would ever forget. You can purchase Jack's book via the affiliate link in the show notes for this episode, available at inallairness.com. Now, onto the show. My guest today began his writing career as a correspondent for the Daily Southtown in Chicago. In 2019, he released his first book, The Greatest Upset Never Seen, Virginia, Chaminade, and the Game That Changed College Basketball. Jack Danilewicz, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
You've lived in Hawaii for over 30 years, but you are a Chicago native, and the story behind your book can be traced back to the Windy City in 1991. Thanks to your stepfather, Len Scaduto, if I pronounce that correctly, who was to become an assistant coach at Chaminade.
That's correct. My stepfather and my mother used to vacation here in Hawaii. Every spring, they would take a group of high school students here to the islands. And having already retired from coaching in 1990 from the high school after 29 years at Oak Lawn, he went over to Chaminade to inquire about a job, and he was hired on the spot by the time he left that day. He left my mom and my grandmother on the beach and went over to Chaminade. And so that's how it began. They came home from vacation. I was a young reporter at the Daily Southtown and broke the good news. I came on vacation in December, not planning to stay. I was just coming for a 10-day vacation. And my first night of my vacation, I went to a Chaminade game on the campus and saw what a small, beautiful campus it was, and was surprised to see that and to realize that they had beaten these huge schools at one time. It was quite an eye-opener for me when I did get here.
That's a great history there. It's quite amazing that it does trace back through those origins. We'll discuss your new book later on. Len, your stepfather, is a key figure. In 1971, he coached Oak Lawn in one of the most famous basketball games in Illinois history. Now, you covered college basketball for 4 years at the Daily Southtown, teams including Illinois, Northwestern, DePaul, and Notre Dame. You're a lifelong Northwestern fan, I believe, and you attended basketball camps on campus as a youngster. How did that love for Northwestern begin there, Jack?
Well, it really goes back to Rich Falk, who was the Northwestern basketball coach at that time. He had played at Northwestern, graduating in '64, and was an assistant coach for a long time. He had such great enthusiasm for Northwestern. He was a great motivator that you couldn't help but be taken in by him. And I and my 3 roommates, who were teammates of mine back in the town I grew up, we used to attend. It was an overnight camp held every summer in July. And it was really because of that. We all became Northwestern fans because of our association year after year with the overnight camp there.
you were granted unlimited access to the 1993 Chaminade basketball team. Chaminade are known as the Silver Swords, thanks to Professor Google. I've since learnt it's a Hawaiian plant prized for its beauty and ability to withstand harsh conditions. Your plan was initially to write a book about that season's squad. However, a conversation that you had with the former voice of the Silver Swords, Gene Davis, who told you about the December 23, 1982 clash and the team's remarkable run in that 1983 season, led to you changing your mind, and the rest is history. Was that retelling from Gene the first time that you learnt about the 1983 team and what they achieved?
Actually, no. I did know a bit about the history of the upsets. I did realize as soon as I started the project and began tracking the 92-93 team that I was going to have to, of course, include the great upsets. And after I met Gene Davis, it just seemed more obvious to write about that team because that's what people wanted to read about. And those were the teams that were known nationally. Whereas the 92-93 team was a very good team at Chaminade. They beat Stanford at the Maui Invitational. The obvious way to go was to track down the players and coach of the 82-83 team because that had been a huge national news story.
The coach that you're referring to there is Merv Lopes. He's the main character of your book. He worked as a counsellor at an intermediate school during the day. He then prepared for the Chaminade practices in the evening. I believe he's 92 years old as we speak. What can you tell us about Merv and the lasting impact that he had on his Silver Swords players?
It was a rare collection of personalities and talent, certainly. But everyone associated with that team, as he has said, was kind of struggling in life. Many of the players would not have been at Chaminade, frankly, if they had had a better offer. He was struggling in life, too, at that time. He had just gone through a divorce. He's really more of a counselor than a coach, in my opinion. He had that kind of effect on everybody that he worked with. I think most of his players at Chaminade will talk about his having been a bit of a father figure in addition to their coach.
The greatest upset never seen. It's currently 11th on Book Authority's list of the top 20 ebooks about college basketball of all time, which is a fantastic honour, especially after I read that you pitched the book well over 10 times without success. How close were you to actually pulling the plug altogether on the project?
Well, I wanted to do the book for many years, and I had pitched some publishers. Probably I didn't get a contract for a while because I didn't really know what I was doing as far as the business end of it. And then I got married and abandoned the project for many years. I did a lot of the interviews in 97, 98, 99. I didn't get back to the book until 2017. So when I got a publisher, I decided to return to it. I had a lot of other things going on in my life. I got married and my wife had children. We had a very busy family life. I was working for a magazine here in Honolulu and also doing social work with youth in the community. Finding time to do it was also an issue. The book was written under not great circumstances because I still had my job at the magazine. And my wife has Parkinson's disease, and her condition began to deteriorate a little bit for part of that time. Not an ideal situation as far as writing goes, but I did get it done, I think, Memorial Weekend 2018. The book was written over a 7-month period.
Sorry to hear about your wife's health. Terrible to hear that. You struck a deal with the University of Nebraska Press in 2017. What do you actually remember most about those 7 or so months that you were writing the book, obviously under difficult circumstances? What was the process behind the scenes there, Jack?
It was all done on a computer, and this is a little strange, but it was written in my bed, which is what I'm talking to you from. And it was a very busy time, but I was engrossed in the book and it kind of wrote itself. Other than figuring out where to put a few things, I never experienced any writer's block. I was excited every day I worked on it. If I was not having a good day or in not a great mood, I would put the project aside altogether and not touch the computer on those days. There weren't a lot of those, but I was always excited to get to work, and I had wanted to do the book for so long.
Now, in the preface of your book, you write that, quote, "The events that led up to that now historic game between the Cavaliers and Silver Swords over the previous 13 days must be afforded equal attention," end quote. You're talking there about figures like Ralph Sampson and Patrick Ewing, Akeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, a contest that was dubbed the Game of the Decade between Virginia and Georgetown. Just to set the scene for our listener, what's important to note here about that lead up to the game itself, Jack?
Well, there were opportunities, obviously, for Virginia to lose, a key one being the Georgetown game. About a week before that, Virginia was in a tournament and won a close game. So there were opportunities for them to lose. And if that had happened, we wouldn't even be talking today. Then they went to Japan, of course, and played Houston and Utah. One of those games was close, the Houston game. The Utah game was not really. So a lot of things had to align for Virginia to remain ranked number one. And if they hadn't been, I don't think we'd be talking now. So that was key. Chaminade had a crazy week beforehand as well. They had beaten the University of Hawaii, which is just 2 miles away and the only Division I program in the state. Then they lost to a small school, Wayland Baptist. They lost that game. So any chance of a Chaminade upset seemed preposterous, certainly at that moment, having lost to an NAIA team 2 nights before. And the Virginia coach, Terry Holland, was in the stands at McCabe Gym on the Chaminade campus that night to see them lose that game to Wayland Baptist. So they were scouted well, Chaminade was.
It's incredible to see the contrast between the two universities at that time as well. You mentioned in the book that Chaminade had fewer than 1,000 students and a history of just 25 years versus Virginia's enrollment, which topped 16,000, and they have a storied history dating back over 150 years. It's an incredible contrast between the two universities.
Most interesting about Chaminade's situation, probably, Adam, was that, as you read in the book, their athletic department was housed in a shack, as they called it, a small wooden structure, temporary structure, which had been built during World War II when the school campus had been taken over by the United States military. They turned it into a military hospital during the World War II years. That was one of 78 structures that had been built. Most of them were torn down. That one remained. It was a laundry room for a time. And in 1976, they turned it over to athletics. It still stands today, although it's no longer the athletic office. But that is quite an eye-opener for anybody who visits the campus. And my stepfather, Len Scaduto, who we've talked a little bit about, when he first arrived at Chaminade, he ran into a security guard, told him he was a basketball coach and wondered where the athletic office was. And the security guard put him in a golf cart and drove him up the hill. He said, "You'll need to go to the shack." And my stepfather was quite surprised at just what the shack was, as anyone is. And the shack was kind of the hub of the athletic department, a rather odd symbol of the university and its growing role as an underdog, because anyone who saw what they were accomplishing without those facilities was certainly impressed.
Oh, it's just an incredible story. And I did lots of side research after reading parts of your book. I'd go online to learn more about certain things. Absolutely fascinating. So I can't recommend it highly enough. The Chaminade Virginia game, the greatest upset never seen, tipped off at 7:40 p.m. Honolulu time on December the 23rd, 1982. That was 12:40 a.m. on Christmas Eve on the east coast of the USA. Now, you say in the book 3,383 fans were in attendance at the Neil Blaisdell Center?
That's correct, yes.
The student body was basically on holiday break. What adds to the magic of the story is that the game wasn't broadcast on TV. Locals that weren't in the building had to rely on Gene Davis, the aforementioned radio man for KGU, I believe, and Virginians had to tune into Mac McDonald's Cavaliers radio call. So that leads to the perfect title for your book.
Well, a lot more people claim to have been there now to the game than 3,383. But some fans were just there to see Ralph Sampson and the number one ranked team in the country. But that was a sensational crowd when you consider this is just an NAIA school, Chaminade was at the time. There was a big crowd. They sounded like 6,000 that night. I used to have a video of the game, which I seem to have misplaced. They had a following by this time, but again, a lot of fans were there to see Virginia. And Chaminade had played Virginia the year before in the same building and had played a pretty good game. I think they lost by 16.
Some more context. Ralph Sampson a 7'4" phenom, then 2-time NCAA Player of the Year. He'd be a 3-time winner after the 1983 season, and of course go on to be the number 1 pick in the 1983 NBA draft. Quite remarkable, to say the least, the talent of his team versus the minnows, I guess you could say, with the Silver Swords. Another of the book's key figures that you write about is Chaminade's Tony Randolph, the 6'6" or thereabouts sophomore centre at the time, who led all scorers in this game with 19 points. Tony was friends with Ralph Sampson in their formative years, which undoubtedly helped him on the night in question.
Yes, that's true. And they had seen in the film that they wanted to bring Ralph out away from the basket, defensively speaking. And Tony gave them the opportunity to do that because he had good range. He was a good shooter. Then, of course, Tony had an incredible game. He shot the ball very well. The whole Chaminade team shot the ball very well that night.
After being tied at the half, the Cavaliers had a 3-minute burst and they took a 56-49 lead. The Silver Swords regrouped and they staved off what most expected may happen, Virginia running away with the win. You detail the play of the game, though. The Swords, Tim Dunham, elevated for a huge dunk off an alley-oop pass from Mark Rodriguez, a distant relative of Coach Merv Lopes. You include Gene Davis's prescient call from KGU Radio, which, if you'll indulge me for a moment, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a friend or family who enjoys sports and has a sense of history, give them a call and tell them to turn on their radio right now," end quote. I thought was a fantastic way to describe things.
Yes, he was a very exciting announcer. Gene's hero was Chick Hearn, the famous Los Angeles Lakers announcer. Chick Hearn began back where I'm from, in Illinois, and was doing the Illinois High School State Tournament for a number of years before he went out to Los Angeles. And in fact, the gentleman who succeeded him, Tom Kelly, soon moved out to Los Angeles, and he was doing Laker games as well. So both of those broadcasters, I think it's interesting that they came from Illinois. The play that you're describing, which was set up by a back pick by Jeff Buich, I think was really the key play of the game. Sports Illustrated called it the play of the year. And I talked to the Virginia players about that. And that was the one play where I think everybody knew that Chaminade was going to be around till the end. They had given up a 7-point lead, and it looked like it was turning into the blowout that everyone expected. But then they very quickly scored 7 straight. Again, I think it was right at that moment that everybody there certainly felt that this was going to go down to the wire somehow.
For a bit of context for our listener here, I'll fill in a few gaps. The game seesawed back and forth until the closing moments and would eventually be settled largely on free throws. Chaminade led 70-68 with barely a minute left. And a name familiar to most people, Virginia's Rick Carlisle, kept his team in the game by hitting a couple of clutch buckets before arguably the most controversial call of the game was made. With about 10 seconds left, a double dribble was called on Virginia's Othell Wilson on a drive to the hoop. There was one last free throw added, and then you write eloquently in your book, quote, "The final tabulation was now forever frozen in time. Chaminade 77, Virginia 72, end quote. Virginia out-rebounded Chaminade 55-31, but the Cavaliers had a would-be season-high turnover count of 25, and the Silver Swords shot an incredible 57% from the field in that second half. Everything came together there for the Silver Swords.
For sure. Chaminade shot the ball very well, but a lot of those shots were defended. They made the most of their shots. There's one shot Richard Hainish took for Chaminade from just to the right of the free throw line, and it was very well defended, and it goes in off the backboard, not the way you teach it from where he was shooting the ball. So it was that kind of night for Virginia. Chaminade made some amazing shots. And if Chaminade had one edge in this game, it was probably in the area of quickness. They were able to match Virginia's quickness. That was very helpful late in the game when they were trying to hold on to the lead. They handled the ball very, very well. The point guard, Mark Wells, who has also passed on, and Mark Rodriguez, they handled the ball well and were able to handle the pressure of Othell Wilson and Ricky Stokes of Virginia.
Speaking of Othell Wilson, he had 15 points in the game, as did Rick Carlisle. Ralph Sampson had 12 points on 4 of 9 from the field, 4 of 7 from the line, but he did have 17 rebounds. For Chaminade, Tim Dunham had 17 points, the next highest scorer to Tony Randolph's 19. Now, you wrote that Chaminade was in the process of changing its name to the University of Honolulu, which would have made it easier to remember and pronounce. However, those plans soon halted in the wake of this giant-killing win.
A very awkward position for the university because sports were, for a long time, a bit of an afterthought. And in fact, in 1995, after I had begun to do some research, an instructor from Chaminade, Dr. Bill Murray, who's no longer with us, told me that back in 1976, when Chaminade began intercollegiate athletics, 50% of the faculty would have been against it if you were to poll them. He said, if you polled them 21 years later, he said this in 96, probably half the faculty would still be against athletics. And so it was kind of interesting from that standpoint that they would find themselves in the position of having to keep the name because there had been so much publicity over the next 10 days about Chaminade, and more publicity than they could ever hope for, certainly.
I think the beauty of your book is that you don't stop at just the greatest upset never seen. You continue to detail the fortunes of both Chaminade and Virginia in parallel for the rest of their 1983 seasons. The Swords and their hope for the NAIA tournament in Kansas City, and also the Cavaliers as they hope to close out the Ralph Sampson era to win an NCAA title. In both instances, unfortunately, spoiler alert, that did not happen, but they got awfully close. What led to your decision to write the book that way, Jack?
Well, I think that, not to sound corny, but it's the journey rather than the destination that always matters with college basketball and high school teams, certainly, during their postseason runs. More than that, Virginia was the most decorated program to probably play during the 1980s, even though they didn't win a national championship. Indiana won two in 81 and 87. Chaminade was plainly the most decorated small school, certainly in the history of college basketball, and were at that time. I wanted to tell their stories. For Chaminade, it was a true dream season. They'd beaten the University of Hawaii from 2 miles away, and then they beat Virginia, which was national news. Everybody expected them to win the national championship in the NAIA format. And Ralph had come back largely for his senior year so that he could win a national championship at Virginia. After his freshman year, his sophomore year, and his junior year, he always weighed whether or not he should leave for the NBA, which he certainly had the opportunity to do, or stay at Virginia. That was a big reason why he came back. And the loss to NC State, which went on to win it all, was one of the hardest losses, I was told, by the Virginia staff that they ever endured. And a big part of that was because they felt so bad for Ralph, who had done so much for the program and who they wanted desperately to get a national championship for.
The 1983 Chaminade basketball team was inducted into the university's Hall of Fame in 2013. Were you there at the time for that celebration, or how have you seen the team honoured in the years since?
I was not there. They have done some nice things for that team. They didn't used to have a display of awards and trophies and things they won. Tony Randolph, actually, when he was coaching there in the late 80s, found a lot of the stuff that they had won and felt it was being neglected. It was in the attic of the shack, and he gathered it all up and brought it home to his house, which is a couple miles from where I'm at right now. And that stuff has remained there since. But there are some monuments on campus as far as that Hall of Fame team that now exists and so forth. An alum donated a beautiful plaque in commemoration of that team's accomplishments, which now sits outside of the gymnasium in a new structure. And I did attend that ceremony in December of 2022.
Aha. Broadcaster Tom Mees, he was the ESPN Sports Center anchor who announced the amazing result on air to those that were still awake in the early hours of Christmas Eve for most of the United States. Sadly, he passed away in 1996, but you did interview him for the book. How did he describe the events?
Well, he was wonderful to interview. I think he was amused by the story. I didn't see the Sports Center that he announced the score on. But many years later, when my stepfather was coaching at Chaminade and they upset Providence, Tom Mees was in the studio and he talked on the air about how he had been on the air that night with Chris Berman that Chaminade had beaten Virginia and how he had gone back upstairs after he made the announcement because he was still unsure if this really could have happened. I was sad to read that he had passed. I tracked him down. He was doing a playoff game. I think he was down in Florida. And I got a very quick return phone call from him. I was asleep and I was awoken by my roommate. Said, Tom Mees is on the phone. It was like 6:30 in the morning Hawaii time when I basically got up and got to the phone. I'm very grateful to him. It was very sad to read about his death about a year later.
Is there anything else from your book that you'd like to make mention of which we haven't covered to this point, Jack?
I don't think so. You've done a thorough job. I think you know more than me at this point. It's pressure to you because it's 2 books ago for me. One myth I would like to clear up, Adam, and thank you for asking. The first Chaminade Virginia game in 1980 took place on the Chaminade campus in McCabe Gymnasium. But the games in 81 and the famous game in 82 took place in an 8,000-seat arena. There's a myth a lot of mainlanders have been led to believe that it was played in a high school gym. That's not true. The Blaisdell Arena is the main concert venue for the big acts. And so Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, the Doors, the Beatles, and Electric Light Orchestra, and Elvis Presley all played at the Blaisdell. So it's a big myth that the game was played in a high school gym. It was not.
You have a new book forthcoming as we record this. Its title is Once in Oak Lawn, the story of a team and a time in high school basketball. We mentioned how it involves your stepfather and his important part in Illinois high school basketball history.
Yes. The 1971 state championship in Illinois was the first and only state tournament to have 2 Chicago teams meet in the final. It had never happened before in the previous 64 years of the tournament. And Oak Lawn had been unranked, even though they were 30-2 heading into the state championship game. But they really came from nowhere, that particular team. They beat the defending state champion in the regionals, which is the first tournament on the way to the main tournament. That was Lyons Township. And then they beat Proviso East High School of Maywood in the sectional opener. Proviso East had won the state championship 2 years before. So Oak Lawn had a very difficult path. No one certainly expected them to go as far as they did, although they obviously had a very talented team. The coach was Len Scaduto, who became my stepfather about a decade later. I kind of have lived this story because my mom and my biological father had gone to Oak Lawn High School, and the whole town of Oak Lawn, which is a Chicago suburb of 60,000 people, was caught up in the excitement of their state tournament run. And at that time, high school basketball was very, very popular. It still is, but more so then when you were crowning only one state champion. Community pride was a big part of the high school sports scene. And you had the Chicago area and the suburbs, and then you had the industrial cities to the south and the farm towns to the south. So Illinois is always a very unique state when it comes to presidential elections because of the difference between the big city to the north and the sprawling flat lands to the south. It made for a great basketball state as well.
You mentioned the history, obviously, with your would-be stepfather. This was always going to be a book in the back of your mind. You just knew that at some stage you had to write the story.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that because I had a proposal for the Oak Lawn book at the same time I had a proposal for the Chaminade book in 2017 and was having a hard time deciding which book to write first and decided to sleep on it. I woke up and I decided to propose the Chaminade book to the publisher, and very quickly they signed me on. But I did feel as though I would eventually get to the Oak Lawn story. When I didn't do it then, I lived the story very much so because of the area that I grew up in, the southwest suburbs. I knew the names of those Oak Lawn players, Tom Dubetz, Brett Arnold, C.J. Kupek, Jim Bosinski, and Bob Carr, long before I knew of Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe and other 70s icons. So I really lived the Oak Lawn story. It was only natural that I would write a book about it. I had access, because of my family relation to Coach Scaduto, access to old scrapbooks, some memoirs that he wrote, and private papers. I've been very blessed to do so many interviews with the people who were on that team and who surrounded that team.
You mentioned in our conversations before we got going today that 2 future NBA players took part in that game.
Yes. Oakland had C.J. Kupek, who went to the University of Michigan, then played for the Los Angeles Lakers and then the Houston Rockets, and then had a long, highly successful career playing over in Europe. And Thornridge was led by Quinn Buckner, who was a junior during the 70-71 season. And he went on to Indiana and the Milwaukee Bucks and Boston Celtics. He finished with the Indiana Pacers. What's interesting about CJ and Quinn is they were both excellent football players as well. CJ played at Michigan for 2 years, and Quinn played football at Indiana for at least 1 year, possibly 2.
I didn't know that about Quinn particularly. I knew he was an outstanding basketball player. Are you planning a trip back to Illinois around the book's release?
Hard to tell at this early date whether or not I'll be able to, but I will certainly be active, if not in person, virtually. I have gotten a lot of great feedback. People really remember that Oakland team from where I am from. It's amazing because they've had stories in the daily newspapers of Chicago about this Oakland team for the 10th, 20th, 25th, 40th, and 50th anniversary. So the story has really been kept alive by the Chicago media. Ironically, I'm the last Chicago writer to take on this project. A lot of my colleagues have written about this Oakland team, and I lived in the house with the coach, but not had written about it. And so finally, I'm going to write what I hope is the definitive account of that 1970-71 Oakland season.
That sounds like a really great read as well. That will be your third book, the one that's coming out.
Yes.
You released your second book in December of 2023. Now, forgive my pronunciation, I think it's Parsegian's Wildcats, devoted to Northwestern's football coach, Era Parsegian, and the 1962 season.
Yes, it's pronounced Parsegian.
Aha.
Most of the book is about the 1962 season, and I pulled the rest of his years at Northwestern into the 62 season. 62 was significant because they had been ranked number 1 for 3 weeks. The last Northwestern team to be ranked number 1. The Rose Bowl team in 95 was ranked 3rd going into the Rose Bowl. I wanted to write the book because it was a chapter in Northwestern football history that hadn't been talked about much anymore because of the great success that Era had when he went on to Notre Dame. But also I was very interested in the time period. And in the year of 62 in particular, it was a very difficult year for America with what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis and racial issues in the United States. The biggest part of the Northwestern 62 season was a 2-week period when they beat Ohio State on the road and came home and beat Notre Dame. During those 2 weeks, that happened to coincide with the 13 days that America was dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I found it fascinating that during one of the most famous periods of Northwestern football, the world was facing, or the United States certainly was facing, this dilemma. A scary time for the country. And my parents were newly wedded at that time. And so this is their era. And it was one more reason why I was interested in writing about the 62 season. The time period, I think, led me to the project as much as my respect for Era Parsegian and what he had done at Northwestern with the football program.
Not that I'm actually a massive football fan, but that does sound very interesting. Dare I ask, do you have any future book plans in the works?
Right now, it's more than enough because I'm hitting the straightaway, so to speak. I'll be done by Christmas Eve, it looks like. I thought about my hockey hero growing up, Dennis Savard of the Chicago Blackhawks. But I'm wondering, too, if I might want to write a book about something a little more current. I've been all over the place as far as the timeline goes. I wrote about 62, 71, and 82 are the years that my 3 books have been about. And so maybe I'll write something that's going on now. We'll have to see.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show today, Jack. I love the book. I'll have a link in the show notes for what it's worth for people to be able to buy the book. Thanks very much, Jack.
Thanks for having me. I'm always excited to talk about what are 3 of my favorite subjects. As we say here in the islands, aloha.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Tap the microphone icon on my website to send me a voicemail. Suggest discussion topics or guests you'd like to hear conversations with. Worldwide, the show has 206 ratings on Apple Podcasts with an average of 4.9 stars with 102 reviews across all providers. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my free NBA history newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming episodes, future guests to appear on the show, and more. Sign up via my website or simply email me, inallairness@gmail.com. You can follow my show in various ways. Search In All Airness, 3 words, on your listening app of choice. The show is available on most platforms. Check the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with a great range of guests. Join me next time for another edition of the show.